Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for coming. I'd like to recognize our board chair, Mr. Ken Weinstein. Over here, Ken. And Amanda Bennett, the director of the Voice of America, here. And Ms. Daisy Sindelar, the acting president of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. I'll be brief, and I have a little short video. I'm really excited to talk about our work at the U.S. Agency for Global Media, and more specifically, the launch of VOA 365. In today's interconnected world, media has the power to reach through TV and mobile screens to activate audiences to action or to suppress them. That's why so many authoritarian governments are afraid of independent media. And that's why professional journalists in closed societies are imprisoned, intimidated, and beaten, and in the case of Jamal Khashoggi, killed for the crime of reporting the truth. Throughout the history of U.S. international media, our mandate has been to provide accurate, objective, professional, and independent news and information that informs, engages, and connects people around the world in support of freedom and democracy. We accomplish that through our 5 networks of USAGM, formerly known as the BBG. Of course, as I mentioned, Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia, the Middle East Broadcasting Networks, which includes the Al Hurra Network, and Radio and TV Marti into Cuba. Every week, more than 345 million listeners, viewers, and online users, unduplicated, tune into our networks. And they do that, and we do that, through 51 languages to over 100 countries. I'm a journalist at heart. Began as a photojournalist when I was 17. Since that time and throughout my career, I've gained a deep respect for the vital role impartial, fact-based journalism plays in our society. By holding people, institutions, and governments accountable to the truth, and by equipping citizens with indisputable facts, journalists demonstrate how democracies should work. I believe that great journalism presents not only the news, but the context for that news. And in turn, it provides audiences with a greater understanding of their world and empowers them to take action within it. We're targeting our resources strategically to provide our news and information to audiences most impacted by state-sponsored disinformation and violent extremism. These vulnerable populations are located, among other places, in Russia and its periphery, China and its periphery, North Korea, Iran, Cuba, Venezuela, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and increasingly now, thanks to the work of the VOA, in refugee camps around the world. And finally, the reason we're here today, we continue to expand our inter-network collaboration with VOA and RFERL, as they did in creating the Russian language global digital network Current Time, which is expanding rapidly and doing very, very well. The creation of these global language networks switches and shifts USAGM's strategy from country-based content to language-based content, meaning we seek to find Farsi speakers in Iran, but also anywhere in the world. We'll distribute this network all over the world. So we have a short video clip to give you a taste of this network. Then I'll conclude and we'll move on with the program. So the video, please.
Introducing the new Global Persian Language Network, created with the resources of Voice of America and Radio Free Europe. VOA 365.
Stand by on camera 1.
For Iranians inside Iran and around the globe. News, analysis, the American story, the world story.
در چندین شهر
United States will withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal.
Exclusive interviews.
ببینید اون موقع در ایران
The people of Iran are not our enemy. They're our friends.
I'm not asking a lot from the Iranian leadership. Don't loot your people.
Original content.
سلام دکتر امینی هستم.
مسائل دیگری خواهد بود که هنوز به فکر ما نرسیده است.
And compelling programs. Quality. Cutting edge. Unfiltered voices. VOA 365.
Right now, USAGM reaches nearly a quarter of all adults in Iran on a daily basis. And that's an impressive 57% growth in reach over the recent past few years. Based on our most recent survey data, a strong majority of RFERL, FARDA, and VOA Persian audiences trust our programming. In fact, 7 in 10 say they trust the programming they get from the USAGM networks. Our audience in Iran is aided by USAGM's internet freedom tools, which allow citizens there to circumvent Iranian government censorship and safely access the free and open internet. At the height of the Iran protests in 2017-2018, USAGM-sponsored circumvention technology averaged 800,000 users per day and ranked in the top 3 downloads among all apps. In addition, our coverage of the President's announcement of the U.S. withdrawal from the Iran deal saw enormous engagement across all platforms. On social media, videos of President Trump's remarks were viewed more than 2 million times. This included simultaneous translation in Persian of the announcement and live reactions from diaspora representatives in Paris and Los Angeles. In 2017, I commissioned an independent third-party review to evaluate our Persian language programming at the Voice of America. It was led by Mr. Ilan Berman, Senior Vice President of the American Foreign Policy Council. The excellent recommendations from that review, combined with our internal analysis and growth strategy, are the foundations for VOA 365. This global network builds on the great work of USAGM's existing strong Persian brands. It's the second language base, as I said earlier, 24/7 global network, and we see more in the future. VOA 365's multifaceted and dynamic programming meets the current market demand among Persian audiences in Iran and globally. You'll hear later how we have reimagined our storytelling by listening to what our audiences want and giving them just that. Overall, the fundamental purpose of USAGM is to empower audiences to own their future and to share the stories of the America we know and perhaps they don't. I believe what we're doing is working. I'm proud of the work we do at USAGM and of this new addition to the USAGM family. Now I have the pleasure of introducing one of the architects of this new global network, Sakara Durashash, and with your panel, I'll let you introduce your panel. Thank you all.
Thanks for the introduction, John. My name is Setare Derashesh, and I'm the director of the Voice of America Persian. And I was tasked by John and Amanda to launch a new VOA 365 channel together with our colleagues at Radio Farda, and that's the Persian language service of RFERL in Prague. The conversation today is going to be on media and politics in Iran, and let me start by introducing our distinguished panelists. Mike Pregent is from the Hudson Institute. He's a senior Middle East analyst and a former U.S. Army intelligence officer. Mike was at the Desert Storm, Desert Shield, and he has over 30 years of experience in counterintelligence, in security, and policy issues in the Middle East. And he also has first-hand experience in countering malign influence of Iran in Iraq. Let me also mention that Mike is the executive director of the Veterans Against Iran.
Not anymore, a long time ago. Veterans Against the Iran deal.
My apologies for that. But you're also a frequent guest on CNN and Fox News.
Yes.
Thank you for being here.
And VOA.
And VOA, of course, and we cherish that. Thank you. Behnam Ben Taleblu is from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He's a senior fellow. He's an expert in internal Iranian matters, especially the IRGC, on sanctions, on non-proliferation. And we're very happy to have him here. He's also a frequent guest expert on CBS, on Sky News, on BBC, and on Fox News. And Greg Sullivan is a senior advisor for strategic communications at the State Department on Iran at the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs. And Greg also directed the launch of the virtual U.S. Embassy Tehran initiative that was in 2011. And it's an online outreach to the Iranian people, Iranian audiences. And today, the Farsi language products of this virtual platform, especially on Twitter and Facebook, are doing very well. We're going to start with a panel in a few minutes, but I just want to talk to you a little bit about the media environment in Iran before we start the questions to our distinguished panel. When we talk about the media landscape in Iran, it's always good to remember that when you look at the latest annual World Press Freedom Index of 2018, you see that Iran is at the bottom of the list, and that's among 180 countries. In the company of Uzbekistan, Cuba, and North Korea. Let me quote something from the same report. State control of news and information has been relentless in Iran for the past 39 years. The Islamic Revolution keeps a tight grip on most media outlets and never relents in its persecution of independent journalists, citizen journalists, and media outlets, and uses intimidation, arbitrary arrest, and long jail sentences imposed by revolutionary courts at the end of unfair trials. The regime has extended its fight against media freedom beyond the country's borders and also targets the international media. This last line explains why the Voice of America Persian and Radio Farda face an extremely hostile environment. It is because of these, where all our products are either jammed, blocked, or on a daily basis, we see interruptions. Because we tell the truth, and as you know, in Iran, truthful information is a rare commodity. Let me show you a picture, an interesting one, I thought, that this is during the visit of Bashar Assad when he was welcomed in Tehran by the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei. What you see on this side is the actual meeting, and the other one is the official website of the Supreme Leader Khamenei. Now, I think Masih Alinejad, who is a very well-known human rights activist, she put it well, and she also contributes to the VOA 365 programming. She put it very well in her Twitter account. And this is what she said. Khamenei's website photoshops his picture with Bashar Assad to make the supreme leader look taller than the Syrian president. The Islamic Republic is all about Photoshop. They Photoshop rockets, they Photoshop Islamic dress on Michelle Obama, but their oppression of people is real. And one more picture that I would like to show you. This is the front page of a newspaper that was immediately suspended when it said in the front page that Bashar Assad is an unwelcome guest, suspended until further notice. Now, during this entire time, the Iranian people were obviously getting very celebratory coverage of the visit by Bashar Assad in Iran because their state media, because it's controlled, all the broadcasting is state controlled and government owned. This is while the Iranian economy is in extremely bad shape. It's in trouble. Half of the country lives below poverty lines. And Iran continues to spend tens of billions of dollars every year on economic and military aid to the regime of Bashar Assad. But Iranians don't see that. They will not hear this on their own television sets and on their own broadcasting. They tune into VOA 365 because we broadcast truthful information and unfiltered and factual. So with this very brief introduction on the media environment in Iran, let me turn to the panel and start with you, Mike Prejean.
Yes.
On this very issue of the state-controlled media, I wanted to get your thoughts on the fact that the Iranian media is hiding from the population the exorbitant cost of Iran's efforts in Syria. And let me just mention that also that recently during a conference in Warsaw in Poland, when I interviewed Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, he told me that Iran is cutting back on its operations in Syria because the money is drying up. What's your take on that, Mike?
The sanctions are working. I mean, if they're cutting back on the funds, I thought there'd be more laughter after that, but I guess not. The sanctions are working. The issue of the media hiding the expenditures and how much it costs to maintain militias in Iraq, in Syria, in Beirut, and in Yemen, the people still know. Regardless of whether or not the media is hiding that, you still see the protesters say, stop spending resources in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen, and spend those resources on us. This is something that when we talked about the Iran deal, when we talked about sanctions, we talked about what members of the IRGC Quds Force and other people associated with supporting the malign activity in the region, the non-nuclear destabilizing activity, the support for militias. We would get the whataboutism arguments. You know, what about Saudi's budget that is 3 times more than Iran's? And the answer I gave is, what's more effective, a F-16 that costs $156 million, or Lebanese Hezbollah that gets $250 million a year? It's Lebanese Hezbollah. It's not the aircraft. So what Qasem Soleimani does very well is he uses that budget to do destabilizing events very well. And to Benjamin Netanyahu's point about it's becoming expensive for Iran to be in Syria, that's a good thing. I think one of the main lessons that Qasem Soleimani learned was that Israel could strike IRGC Quds Force targets in Syria with impunity, and Russia had no interest in defending these entities and these proxies on the ground in southern Syria because it wasn't aligned with their strategic interests. So there's been a cost associated with Syria that depended on support from Russia that Soleimani didn't receive. So I'm glad that it's becoming expensive in Syria, but I'm also warning that Iran is offsetting U.S. sanctions by penetrating Iraq's economy. And we continue to sanction individuals in Iraq, bankers, and banks for violating sanctions, and we continue to even press some of our allies in the KRG, to include the KDP, Peshmerga, or the KDP side of the KRG, that have actually floated contracts or recommended contractors to U.S. Gov for part of that $30 billion for reconstruction to companies that were directly tied to the IRGC Quds Force. So you see that, we were having a conversation earlier with Barbara Slavin from the Atlantic Council. Qasem Soleimani knows Iraq better than we do. He knows Syria better than we do. He knows Lebanon better than we do. And he knows Yemen better than we do. And he's really good at this. And the best way for us to actually affect what he is doing in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and Beirut is to do some of the things, to add on to some of the things we already do. Right before the panel, I informed Ben that Harakat Nujaba, an IRGC Quds Force militia, was just designated. That's a big thing. So now you have Kitab Hezbollah designated in Iraq and Harakat Nujaba. And the reason I mention them is they're also in Syria. They're part of Qasem Soleimani's force that's been stepping into Jordan and trying to step into Lebanon to do things to destabilize both Amman and also to threaten Israel. This is a big deal, but Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes, who's a leader of Kitab Hezbollah, a designated terrorist group in Iraq, controls the Hashd al-Shabi budget, and the salaries are $1.6 billion a year. So how does Qasem Soleimani maintain operations in Syria? he's going to get a cut of that $1.6 billion going to the Hashid al-Shabi, that Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes is in charge of that budget distribution, a designated terrorist, and Hadi al-Amri, who is a leader of Badr. So there's ways to do it, and they know how to do it. We know they're doing it. We just don't want to take action to stop it.
Thank you, Mike. I want to stay with this high cost. And Ben, I want to talk to you about something that we reported on VOA 365 about 10 days ago. And that is when the Iranian parliament voted and allowed the government to withdraw 1.5 billion euros from the National Development Fund's reserves to boost its defense sector. Now, some of the experts are saying that this money is not going to be able to be added to the 2019 budget year because of what also you mentioned, Mike, because the sanctions are working, because this massive decline in oil revenue that they're hit by the U.S. sanctions. Now, I have a two-part question for you, Ben. With the with the projection of the negative 3.6% growth of the 2019 budget in Iran, does this mean that the defense spending is unsustainable? And then I think Mike responded, but I want to get your answer also. Does this mean, is this an indication that the U.S. sanctions or the sanctions on oil are working?
So I think there's a lot there. And first, let me felicitate the inauguration of the 24/7 Persian Language Media Network and thank the panel for sharing the stage with me today. Listen, I think there's not only one way to measure sanction success, right? If you have the perfect strategy for sanction success, I think it's three big terms. It's punishment for past behavior, coercion to stop current bad behavior, and deterrence to prevent future bad behavior. That's the ultimate sanction success scenario. But we'll take whatever we can get along these three different parts along the way. And I think even if you don't have a change of behavior tomorrow, as long as you're raising costs to Iran, as long as you're putting them to the choice, as members of the administration have said, then you are seeing the early dividends, the green shoots of sanctions, forcing the Iranians to choose in every theater which one matters more, Syria, Yemen, Iraq, which militia matters more within Iraq, which person within that militia matters more. And every time you put the regime to a choice, you force it to fight with one arm behind its back. And you have to be cognizant that Iran does believe that ultimately it is supporting something that was in Persian on the stage up there, Axis of Resistance or the Resistance Front. It has a constellation of forces that it supports that are fundamentally anti-American and antithetical to U.S. values, interests, and partners, and is going to find ways to do that, come high cost or come low cost. So it behooves the U.S. to increase the cost as much as possible. So when it comes to the defense budget point, you know, if you're looking to do a line item of the Iranian defense budget, I would say that you're going to have to keep looking, right? Because the strength of the Quds Force is not just what it gets from the line item. It's what it gets from the, illicit jetties that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps operates in the Persian Gulf. It's what it gets from illicit black market, businesses. It's what it gets from front companies. It's what it gets from Iranian-owned or controlled businesses outside of Iran. Look at the last sanctions regime. Just consider, the whole Babak Zanjani SWIFT thing. We took Iranian banks off of SWIFT, and of course, there were Iranian-owned or controlled banks in places like Malaysia helping process oil payments. So knowing where the holes in the sanctions architecture were last time and plugging it and making sure that you just don't see declining revenue for Iran. You see multiple indicators of macroeconomic contraction. And I think that's how you'll be able to tell if Iran is really hurting. It's not just moving one thing on the line item. That's a useful indicator, but it shouldn't be the only indicator.
So the sanctions are working, as Mike also was saying. Now, let me stay on the sanctions also, but Ben, I want to come back to you because I want to ask you about the main source of wealth of the IRGC, but we can come back to that. Greg, staying on the topic of sanctions, we get a lot of questions from the Iranians inside Iran when they hear from their television and their broadcasting that this major jump in the prices of medical instruments and medication is the direct result of the U.S. sanctions alone. Now, our reporters checked with the U.S. Department of Treasury, and they verified that sanctions exempt humanitarian goods like food and medicine and so forth. What is the State Department's take on that?
So, anyway, just taking a step back to talk about sanctions in general, both my colleagues, they've hit the point I would have made, which is the objective of sanctions is to raise the cost of Iranian bad behavior, of Iranian adventurism around the region, or attempts to foment discord. And when you look at the data, the challenge that Iran faces, all of the data is really against them. You have the real losing 8% of its value over the past year. You have inflation at 30%. You have youth unemployment around 25%. But meanwhile, you have a 40% increase in defense expenditure inside of Iran since the signing of the JCPOA. By our estimate, and we don't think it's a comprehensive estimate, we think of more than $16 billion has left Iran to support the Assad regime in Syria. Mm-hmm. So these numbers can't continue to exist at this level. And you already see the outcome of this. You see teachers inside of Iran. They're on the second day of demonstrations today. This is their fourth demonstration since December of 2018. You've had truckers, you've had agricultural workers. Many people have been demonstrating over the course of the last 2 years. And it all goes back to the decline in subsidies, the decline in paychecks, the overall decline in purchasing power inside of Iran. That is the objective of U.S. sanctions. It is to raise the cost and to put a fine point on the fact that the Iranian government is making choices about what they're going to fund that do not serve the needs of the Iranian people, and to raise the cost of this kind of activity in Syria and Yemen and in support of Hezbollah. Mm-hmm. So that's the real objective. As far as, and you mentioned correctly, humanitarian supplies, relief for earthquakes, all of those materials are permitted. Medicines, vaccines, mm-hmm. all those materials are permitted to go into Iran under the sanction regime. But it requires an entity inside of Iran to make that request. We need to be able to see a request from someone. There has to be somebody on the other end mm-hmm. that receives these materials. The Iranian government makes sure that there is no one on the Iranian side of the equation making a request from the United States for those supplies. When there is an earthquake in Iran, we always make an offer of support of earthquake assistance. We haven't been taken up on that offer since 2003. The Iranians always reject our offers of humanitarian relief. So it's an old expression, but it takes two to tango. Mm-hmm. There has to be somebody in Iran making a request for humanitarian supplies, and to receive those replies, if we have that, then certainly it's something that could go through the sanctions. Treasury OFAC, there's a standing general license to permit those supplies to go into Iran, but the Iranian government makes sure that those demands are never made. Yeah.
Greg, you touched on something extremely important that I would like to talk about. Let's move on from sanctions because we don't have much time, and I will. And I have to listen to Leslie, and she's telling me it's time for questions, but let me put in a question on protest, which is extremely important, and I don't want to miss from the panel to respond to that. In the opening remarks also, John mentioned the extensive work that the Voice of America Persian did during the protest that started a year ago, and it started in Mashhad and then spread out to more than 80 different cities in Iran, and we were getting videos from the protesters, and we were incorporating this in our broadcast and digital platforms. Ben, I wanted to ask you about your projection on the protest, especially considering that next year, in 2020, Iran is going to have legislative parliamentary elections.
Yeah, I definitely think that, and of course the presidential elections in 2021, and of course a major potential flashpoint could be the death of the supreme leader in God knows any time.
Well, we've been talking about this for a few years.
Yes.
But eventually it's going to happen.
And eventually
right?
It's going to happen. But these three flashpoints, coupled with what happened in Mashhad and then spread across the country in late 2017 and consistently since then, is important. Because when you look at the bulk of protests in Iran, 94 Ghazvin, IRGC deployed to put them down, 99 Tehran protests based in the university, spread out across the city, 2009 Green Movement, 3 million people on the streets, sustained about for a week. And then, of course, the 2017 protests are qualitatively different because I like to say they're not with people who have genes cooler than you and I. They're from the social base of the regime, the urban and rural poor, the downtrodden and dispossessed, as Khomeini would say. And the fact that they are now on the streets means that the regime has lost the social base. And the fact that they echo previous protest slogans that in 2009, not Gaza, not Lebanon, my life for Iran, those types of slogans, those types of quite hyper-nationalist slogans, means that there is a connectivity between these different levels of Iranian strata, and that the regime is going to have to start paying off people that it thought were previously loyal. And that feeds into this sanction strategy that you were talking about, and permits every opportunity to be a potential flashpoint for the regime, to put it to a choice at every chance. the elections, quote unquote, in 2020 and 2021, the death of the supreme leader, every market decision, every import decision, every license not granted. So the goal, of course, is to highlight that, for lack of a better word, the regime in Iran is not putting Iran first. And when the social base of the country understands that, you know you're in trouble.
It's very important, the social base, as you were mentioning. Mike, I wanted to ask you something about what's happening right now in Venezuela and the protesters in Iran and the regime. They're following very closely the U.S. moves and the support for regime change. What are your thoughts?
So I think it's very interesting. We're actually hosting a panel at Hudson to talk about this. Venezuela through the eyes of Iran, Russia, Turkey, and China. And what we're seeing is we're seeing the regime look at what the Maduro government is doing to learn lessons, what to do, what not to do. But more importantly, the opposition is hearing these clear strategic messages from the U.S. If you organize and you give us a leader we can support, we can do the same. Whether that's true or not, it's believed. Right. And whether that's true or not, it's resonating with the Islamic Republic, the leadership there. Venezuela is a way to message Iran's opposition. So if you get yourself together and you get us a leader we can be behind, then we can use these sorts of strategic messages. And I think that's very interesting. Venezuela is key. If you see our geopolitical foes are lining up in support for Maduro, the level of Lebanese Hezbollah and RGC Quds Force support to the Colectivo, the 30 or so militias that have been basically operate like a Basij, operating in Caracas and other places to get people in line. It's very interesting. There are accidental strategic messages that are resonating with the Islamic Republic. One was the president's statement, "We're sending Iraq to watch Iran." In D.C., everybody got upset about that. That's really not how you do these things. But in the Islamic Republic, it resonated. And in Iraq, it resonated in a positive way, as in, yes, good. The other message is this regime change support in Venezuela, something that we stay away from when it comes to the Islamic Republic and other places because of the argument that, we want to put 160,000 troops into these countries. It's not the case. There's already there's something that I think can be mirrored in Iran. The security forces in Venezuela, whenever there's a protest, they see family members in the crowd. And there's a family member ratio between protesters to soldier that basically if you have 10 Venezuelan security forces, they can see family members in the crowd. So nobody's going to shoot on the crowd because they might kill a family member. I'm sure that's the same when it comes to Iran, when it comes to the security forces there. So there are a lot of things that we can look at. But again, our country's geopolitical foes and adversaries know that the election's 609 days away. Yeah. And our enemies have a clock that's a lot longer than ours, and they can wait us out. And we need bipartisan solutions to a lot of this.
Talking about protests and also the opposition, back in December at the Washington Institute, Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi had a speech, and we covered that extensively. And he's also trying to unite the opposition abroad. But he made an interesting point, which is a new development, and he said that he called it a widespread refusal by the military forces and the paramilitary to join, to suppress the protesters.
Right.
So do you agree with that, or is this, you think, a sign of a fallout between the army and the Sepah?
Well, we look at the security forces. I learned that most IRGC members are very poor, from poor families and poor areas. So they tend to be more supportive of the people. The regular army will not shoot on the people, and the Basij also comes from the poor families in Iran. I think that message is one that we're seeing the examples in Venezuela actually push people in that direction. We want the security forces to see their family members in these crowds so that their grievances can actually be dealt with as opposed to put down, such as been the case in previous. I'm very aware, so I'm trying to speed this up. There are examples here. In previous protests it's been put down by force, and this one really hasn't been yet, and that's a good thing.
A very, very short question that I have for Greg, if I may, and I want to jump into the internet because I think it shows a little bit the direction where the country is going, and I know you have a very vibrant and very active sets of assets in social media in Persian. But as of today, our website is blocked, our social media platforms are blocked, and with the help and the support of Congress, we have circumvention tools, and I'm sure you're using that too. But the question I have for you, Greg, is that we are getting media reports that Iran is trying to borrow from China tools to tighten its grip again on the internet. Have you heard any of these reports, and are you concerned about that? And I'm sorry to do it very fast.
No, that's fine. And it's actually, this is not the first time we've heard something along these lines. A couple of years ago, the buzzword that was going around was that Iran was going to try to create its own halal intranet, and they had this plans to seal off the country electronically from other outlets. That never panned out either. The reality is. The Iranian consumer base, the information consumer base, is so sophisticated in the use of circumvention technology, proxy servers, VPNs. There's a knowledge there that allows the Iranian people to stay generally one step ahead of the Iranian intelligence services. They, for the most part, they've engaged in IP address blocking, and that's a very old school, unsophisticated way of dealing with this. When Iranians can, use a proxy server to bounce out of the country and come back in, hit websites or without being detected by an Iranian service provider, well then that IP address blocking is not working. That's the key there. It's going to be a continuous game of whack-a-mole that the Iranian government tries to play. We're trying to play a role in helping the Iranian people get access to information. Making sure that they have access to those tools. You have an incredibly successful Iranian American community, well represented in the entertainment industry, in academia, in IT. They too play their own role in supporting people inside of Iran, helping them get the tools that they need to get information. My money's on our side of the equation, to be quite honest. Certainly something to watch, and we'll keep an eye on it. But like I said, the Iranian government tried to do this once before by creating an Islamic halal intranet, and that never materialized.
And it's important, the circumvention tools, you're absolutely right. And with what is happening with all what they're blocking, our VOA Persian's Facebook and Twitter are the top 10 most popular Persian social media accounts in Iran.
That's been our experience, that there is such a voracious appetite for information that is not controlled by government agencies inside of Iran, that if you put it out on the internet, Iranian users will find it.
Thank you very much, Ben. We never got to you to talk about the main source of wealth of the RGC. That's maybe another panel.
Sure.
Thank you so much. Let me just go and very, very few questions, please, because we're out of time. Barbara.
Yeah, thank you. Do you need a mic, or can I just talk loud? I'll just talk loud. Barbara Saban from the Atlantic Council. Congratulations on being able to launch this service. How do you deal with questions about U.S. policy? Because I think there's been a lot of confusion about what the purpose of the sanctions is. You've mentioned sharpening a choice, but Iran is still intervening in all these countries. People having difficulty getting food and medicine. Some of that is because of banking difficulties, which are related to the sanctions. So how do you explain the purpose? Is it to punish Iran for policies we don't like? Is it to get them to return to negotiations? Mike, you mentioned that Iran may just simply wait out this administration in hopes of new policies. So how do you describe U.S. policy to an Iranian audience?
Ben?
I can.
Sure.
The way we try to explain it, and our Special Representative Brian Hook really tried to make this point at the Warsaw Ministerial, which is that the objective is not to punish the Iranian people, it's to compel Iran to come back to the negotiating table by raising the cost of all of these other activities. The cost of nuclear and ballistic missile proliferation, of regional destabilization activities. That's the objective. I recognize it is a challenge, and we are spending some time thinking about how can we put some real examples to our desire to engage in outreach to the Iranian people. Barbara, you know, we've spoken about this before in the past. We have had, since about 2006, the State Department, under both the Republican and Democratic administration, engaged in vibrant people-to-people engagement, promoting civil society collaboration between American participants and Iranian representatives. We've collaborated in areas like seismology, environmental science, water resource allocation. That's actually something we want to get back to. We would like to promote greater collaboration between American and Iranian civil society audiences for the mutual benefit of both societies. And we think there's a real opportunity in environmental science. Iran faces critical problems in air pollution and water resource allocation. There's a challenge there too, obviously. Iran itself has turned on much of its environmental community. 8 environmentalists have been arrested. There was an arrest just this morning, Afshin Vanati, an environmentalist in the Kurdish area. He too was arrested, raising the number of high-profile environmentalists to 9 that we're aware of. But this is an area where Iran faces a critical need, where civil society activists have engaged in activities that are trying to help the Iranian people. And it's actually something that we would love to see go forward, because we think it builds, it helps build civil society inside of Iran and takes this issue away from the decision-making of the IRGC and promotes a better understanding of what the U.S. represents inside Iran. It's something we'd like to get back to, and we're spending some time thinking about it, but obviously there's a lot of challenges there.
Maybe we can take one more question.
Sorry, I talked to you. No, it's good.
Good afternoon. My name is Abdi Yabaro from the VOA Somali Service. Somalia is probably only country in the world for the last 27 years without a central government that effective in the whole country. And for the last 3 years was a Shabab domination, attacks every place. But lately also we hear that Daesh came in influence, particularly in the northeastern part. And there is a sense of that our analysts keep telling us that there is a Iran hands in Somalia, because Irani's madrasas were kicked out 3 years ago, and Iran with Qatar, the present president and its group came from an allies of Qatar. So that this allies and hidden agenda. I wonder if you guys can elaborate if there is an evidence or any documentation that Iran has involvement in Somalia. Thank you.
Mike, do you want to take that?
Yeah. I was going to kick it to Ben, actually.
I have a very brief response for you. Reuters has had some very good reporting on the alleged smuggling routes for Iranian small arms and missile sections from Iran through the Arabian Peninsula using human trafficking and drug trafficking routes into Somalia, then from Somalia into Yemen. Of course, so this is a primarily naval route, and it's a speculated route, but it's a route that Reuters has covered, and I think was alleged, if I'm not mistaken, in one of the UN panel of experts reports on Yemen. But there has been some reporting on Iran looking to use human trafficking and drugs trafficking routes for arms trafficking into the Yemen theater. But outside of that, I'm not particularly familiar with Iranian involvement in Somalia. But it must be said that Iran does have an extensive madrasa recruitment network in sub-Saharan Africa, as it does in Latin America, because whereas in much of the Middle East, Iranian hard power defines the game, in these countries where Iran plays to the anti-imperialist, anti-status quo orientation, Iran actually recruits people from the tri-border area in Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa to become the second, third, fourth generation cadres of people in its madrasas in Iran. And it's telling that, Iranians inside Iran aren't lining up to become clerics. It's foreigners. It's people who Iran seeks to still spread the Islamic revolution to.
Okay, I don't think we have any more time for questions. I want to thank our wonderful panelists. I could not have had a better panel with your thoughts. Thank you very much. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Hello, everybody, and welcome again. And this time we're going to be talking a little bit about the main show, which is the launching of our new VOA 365. And I think you've already heard from Sitara Darakshish and Mehdi Kapanchi, and I'd like to acknowledge my counterpart here, Daisy Sindelar, who is the acting president of RFE-RL, and it's our partner here. And so we just heard a little bit about the media environment here. We've had a very good description of that, both in terms of the tight control, but also the violent, perhaps, interest of the people there, the creativity in getting out to see news. So it's against that backdrop that we will be talking about VOA 365. But first I'd like to show a little film that gives a little primer on what VOA 365 is, and then we'll launch into the questions here of our panelists.
VOA 365 provides the people inside of Iran with a truthful accounting of what's happening within their own country and also what's happening in the United States of America. We learned something through the creation of Current Time, our Russian language global network, that if we take two of our large networks like Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and work together on a common project, it acts as a force multiplier. And we're able to reach audiences with really two distinct types of information.
RFERL and VOA are logical partners. On the one hand, you have VOA, whose mission is to tell America's story abroad. On the other, you have RFERL, whose job is to serve as a substitute for local media in countries without a free press of their own.
VOA has a really strong presence in Iran, but like every media market, it's getting younger, and people are looking for a different pace, a different kind of programming, a different kind of engagement.
So USAGM is targeting younger and more sophisticated audiences by using the platforms that they use, mobile and social platforms that allow us to interact one-to-one with people on the device that's in their hand instead of maybe the one that's on the wall in their home.
The new version of Farda's Breakfast with News is visually enhanced and richer in content. We have doubled the number of stories in each bulletin, which means the new version runs at a faster tempo, packed with the latest news, analysis, social media reports, press reviews, sports, and infotainment.
We're also providing a lot more cultural and entertaining content that gives an insight into what American life and what the American people are like.
We look to connect with citizen journalists inside Iran, people with the courage to send us video footage or audio recordings or even personal anecdotes about the news that they're experiencing firsthand.
VOA 365 is a global 24/7 digital network. It's designed to reach audiences inside Iran, but it's also designed to reach Farsi speakers anywhere around the world.
There's Iranians in the Middle East, there's Iranians in Europe, there's Iranians in the United States, and all of them have one thing in common, and that is they're interested in news in Farsi, and they're interested in news about the United States, they're interested in news about Iran.
Looking ahead, we're going to plan on launching new global language networks, perhaps Mandarin, even English, Arabic, Spanish. It allows us to continue the wide expansion of USAGM that has really begun in the last 3 or 4 years.
People inside Iran are hungry for independent, impartial, unbiased, and trustworthy news sources, and the VOA 365 will provide just that.
Well, USAGM's mission is to inform, engage, and connect with audiences all over the world in support of freedom and democracy. This fulfills our mission by getting free and fair media into Iran for the Iranian people to hear what's really going on, both here in the United States and around the world.
Great, thank you very much. Now let me start with you, Sitara. This is a joint venture project between Radio Free Europe and Voice of America, similar to our Current Time operation, but you led the project here, starting here in the United States. And I'd like to ask you, the Persian service of Voice of America has been here around forever, so is Farda. What caused us to want to do this? What caused you to want to do this? And what's the purpose of this?
Well, I think one of the objectives was the changing media market and the youth in Iran and the tools that they were using. That's how we transitioned from radio to television and then from television to digital. That's, I think, one of the main reasons for us to continue to be one of the leading international broadcaster in Farsi in the Iranian media market, and we have to compete, and we need to do that, and with the tools that we have, we are doing it. And also something that John mentioned in his opening remarks, we had an independent report about 2 years ago that looked at the programming, content, production of the Voice of America Persian, and they had some recommendations. We took that very seriously, and we are following that. And we made all the possible changes from the production values, from the content, from the guests that we're having, from the studios. And I want to thank John and Amanda also to give for the funds that you gave us to make this happen, to make this possible. And three very important elements of this new VOA 365 that are very, very different from what we have from the Persian service. One of them is the continuous collaboration with our colleagues in Prague. And we do have on a daily basis a report from Prague, and this is a joint collaboration. This is a joint venture. Another one is live and breaking news. This is now our trademark for the VOA 365, which is extremely different than what we were doing before. We are bringing the news, live events. We are covering the president, we're covering the vice president, we're covering all the key congressional, Iran-related congressional hearings, live, direct, immediate to the households inside Iran. And the way it is happening right now. And this is something that we never did before, and we're getting a lot of very positive and solid impact from our very grateful viewers inside Iran. They're asking for more. And the third one, again, I want to thank John for that, because he kept his word. He does keep his words, but on this particular one, that he wanted to bring in top shelf quality programming, American commercial TV programs as acquired programming for us. And this is what we have right now that we didn't have before, like the Smithsonian Channel, ABC, like the documentaries from CNN. So these are the three things that we added to the VOA 365 that I think we all welcomed, and we're very happy to continue doing.
Thank you. Mehdi, what I'd like to ask you is what's the importance of your contribution, Fardah's contribution to this, and particularly talk to me about news and news in the morning, which you're contributing, and then I'll maybe turn it over to Satara for the same question.
Sure. I mean, as Satara mentioned, this is a 24/7 news channel, and we are providing the early morning news for the channel. We have an hour-long news magazine early in the morning from 7 to 8 Tehran time, and then on top of every hour from 8, 9, 10, 11 until 1 p.m. we have news bulletins on top of every hour. This is important because there is only, apart from IRIB's news TV channel, there is only one other provider outside Iran which provides news early morning. So VOA 365 is one of the major players which provides live news early morning for the Iranian audience.
And Satara, you just already very clearly talked about the change in the liveliness of the news, the immediacy of the news. Tell me the role that trust plays in our providing of the news to the Iranian people, both in terms of what they expect and how they react to it.
Well, it's very simple, and I'm not going to be long on that, Amanda. We stick to facts. We give factual, unfiltered news and information to Iran. And that's why we have our credibility. That's it.
And we have, between us, some pretty impressive credibility numbers. Do you guys remember off the top of your heads?
I think John mentioned earlier that 7 out of 10 people trust what USA James Farsi, VOA and Radio Farda is providing, which is a testimony of what we are doing there. So if the people did not trust us, then they wouldn't watch us or listen to our radio programs. And 7 out of 10 is an amazing number, I guess.
I think it's a number that journalists in this country would envy and try and emulate to come even half that.
And I just want to go back to what we discussed during the panel, the media environment in Iran, because it is it's very restricted, as the reports that I was quoting from the World Press Freedom Index of 2018, and also for the internet. And that's one of the reasons they do not have any other options. This is what they get. So they turn to VOA 365 to get this type of news.
So I'm getting a signal that it's about time for us to wrap up already. We're just kind of getting warmed up. But I have a very important question, and that is that you both, we understand that the Iranian diaspora, both in Europe, where you're located, in the United States here, is very, very polarized, very, very passionate, very, very eager to engage with us. And you both have faced incredible criticism about the news and information that you provide, and of you personally. And I think there's probably people in this room who would like to express some of the criticisms. And in fact, the creation of this network had its root in some criticisms about the potential biases that we showed. So, we've heard criticism that we're the voice of Trump. We've heard criticism that we're the voice of the mullah. Sitara, tell me about how you react to those charges.
We've had lots of attacks, Radio Farda and VOA Persian, so we are together in this, Mehdi. But I think the question should be directed at those who are criticizing or attacking the Voice of America Persian or having these accusations of bias. And unfortunately, this leads usually to smear and instead of having a very serious conversation about it. But if you want my opinion, if you want my take on it, because VOA Persian is part of the larger Voice of America in USAGM, and these are the critics that some folks have about the USAGM, and they count us, and of course we have heard the accusations that are baseless, that we are, the VOA Persian is following the Obama administration policy on Iran, which again is ridiculous. We have people who are Obama holdovers. That is also ridiculous and false. And the topic of Iran is extremely emotional for the diaspora. And we understand that some members of the diaspora, some representative of the diaspora, would like only for their views, strictly their views, to be broadcasted, represented in our, on our digital platforms and for broadcasting on television. We have to remember that we have a charter. We have a mission at the Voice of America. We base our work on this mission and on that charter. We have a professional obligation to cover all sides. This is a free country, but this is an American debate on foreign policy. And we cover that. If the president pulls out of the nuclear deal, we have an obligation as reporter and journalist to cover that. But then after that, Nancy Pelosi says, wait a minute, this is part of national security. We cover that, we report that. When Senator Warren puts out a statement on the JCPOA and supports that, we cover that. At the same time, when the president puts all his might, the might of the White House, we also have to report that. Or John Bolton, with his views that he has on Iran, we do cover that. So I think that it's more the fact that some members of the diaspora want only one line of thinking that should be what we're covering. And we would like to give them a platform, obviously, but that's the reason why we are obligated to talk about different views and talk about American foreign policy. We understand that they get very upset about that. We understand that they only want their views and no other views, but this is what we do. And we stick to the facts, and our programs speak for themselves, and they can check it.
And can I quickly mention something? I think as Sitara said, we learn from criticisms. When it's constructive, then we learn from it, and it's fine. But when it turns to smear campaign, and as Sitara mentioned, some people want to hear what they like, and then they wouldn't really, they are not interested on the other side of the debate. And when there is a debate going on and we are reporting it, we have to keep the balance and tell the story of both sides. And in general, I think when we are attacked by both sides of the debate, it means we are doing our job properly. And this is the case, and most of the times we are being attacked by both sides of the argument, which I think, most of the times it is reassuring. It means we are doing our job.
And Mehdi raised, if I may, Mehdi raised a very good point also. When there are criticism from both sides, it's okay for one side to push their own arguments. The problem arises when the other side is very shy to talk. The other side is not a counterbalance. This is where the issue comes.
Well, we had such a short time, we wasn't able to talk about time for questions. I see she's waving this time for questions thing at me. We weren't able to talk about the automotive programs and the cooking programs and the
Max Wheels and the diaspora.
Yeah, all these things. We have wonderful, actually very wonderful cultural programming and interesting programming that I wish we had more time to talk about. But I'm taking my orders from the cue cards. Questions here, please. Anybody?
Tell us about the cultural program.
We have a question from the audience about the cultural program. Would you care to talk a little bit about?
Well, VOA 365's main focus is obviously news, what I mentioned, but we do have lots of cultural programming also, and a lot of them are from acquired programming. And we do have lots of diaspora programming also, human rights. We make a point to cover that on a daily basis. And it's a variety of different programs that we have, including cultural, including diaspora, including women's programs, including minorities and ethnic and religious.
So I think we also, as you said, cooking, travel.
The travel
ABC.
show, by the way, is very good. We have ABC. Yeah, we have ABC. We have that includes also the George Stephanopoulos this week with George Stephanopoulos. Excuse me. And then we have a travel show, and we will have Anthony Bourdain very soon.
Yeah, Anthony Bourdain pretty soon, and also, we also have our own wonderful homegrown VOA and RFURL investigative projects that tackle global issues like Rohingya and like Boko Haram and like the opioid crisis that we also, and then the Greta Van Susteren show and VOA Connect, which is an English language program that all get translated and run on the VOA FARDA.
That's absolutely right. And I just want to mention something, Amanda, that VOA 365 would not exist if it wasn't for the programming input of the other projects and products of VOA. And with your blessing, we had the very important projects of investigative journalism that we are using. As you mentioned, we're versioning that. It is part of our programming. So we owe that also to Amanda to put it together for us and what we have at VOA. It was not only the investigative, but also when I talked about minorities, the project that you had for the Rohingya. So we use those also. And we're expanding our versioning unit, by the way.
Terrific. Does that answer your question, Mr. Eisen? Thank you very much. Any other questions? Well, we can talk about Anthony Bourdain some more then. Anyway, thank you very much. I hope you get a chance to take a little more look at this because it's a really wonderful and engaging channel and a wonderful cooperation. So thank you very much for all being here.
Thank you, Amanda, Satira, Mehdi. Thank you all for coming. Thanks to staff from USAGM, from Voice of America, from RFERL. I want to recognize David Ensor, former president. And finally, I want to thank Chairman Engel for helping us secure this space to have this conversation today. So thanks, everybody.